All righty. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar on Mythos, 5 Best Practices for Identity Security Leaders. My name is Katie Curtin-Mestre, and I'm with the Delinea marketing team. I'm joined by Jason Mitchell, SVP of Engineering at Delinea, and Brian McHenry, VP of Sales Engineering. So Jason, why don't you kick us off, and let's just say there might be some people out there who've been completely off the grid since April 7th, and they aren't up to speed on the Mythos news. Can you share with them what all of the commotion is about?
Yeah, sure. A couple of months ago, Anthropic released a new model, and this model was specifically trained to look at vulnerabilities in software. And they were so worried about releasing it to the public that they invited about 50 cybersecurity companies and gave them early access to that. It was so successful, it found over 10,000 vulnerabilities, and many of those vendors kind of published, how complex these vulnerabilities were to find. And so it really kind of shocked the market a little bit about what is possible. I think the important thing here that we're going to talk about is it's not just Mythos, it's about the trend of these new models and how capable they are. So it can be helpful for us to check our own software. I mean, we're going to use it, so we check Delinea software, but it also means that the threat actors have access to it and they can start to check for these vulnerabilities. And so it's something that security professionals need to be prepared for and build a solution for.
Gotcha, Jason. And there's certainly a lot for security teams to consider right now. Now, when you see a lot of the conversation about Mythos in the press, there's been a lot of focus on the role of the vulnerability teams, the infrastructure teams, and the application security teams, the roles that they need to play to secure their organizations. However, there hasn't been a lot of discussion on the role of identity security. Brian, what's your sense on why that has been the case? And is identity security relevant to this conversation?
Well, with the focus on vulnerabilities, doesn't necessarily, in most cases, doesn't really relate to identity. But the reality is identity teams have one of the biggest roles to play in reacting to this shift in the threat landscape, possibly the biggest role. Patching and hardening are always going to lag behind a model like Mythos or GPT 5.5 Cyber that finds 0 days every single day. But identity controls don't depend on the patch cycle at all. They govern who and what gets in, what those users and systems can actually reach once they're inside, and then how long that access sticks around. So while everyone else is working feverishly to close those vulnerabilities, the identity teams really need to be focused on hardening their identity security layers so that they can limit whatever the attacker can actually do once they've successfully exploited one of these vulnerabilities. And if it's done right, the identity security layer will hold up and be resilient to what ever attack that may come from one of these very powerful AI-driven threats.
That's great, Brian. And it really makes sense. And it's a very important reframe. Identity is the layer that doesn't depend on how fast everyone else can patch. As you can imagine, customers are coming up to us and saying, there's a lot to do. Where should we start? Across the 9,000 plus customers Delinea works with globally, including more than half of the Fortune 100, we keep seeing the same pattern. The teams making real progress break down the work into 5 best practices, so identity teams have a concrete place to start. Jason, can you walk us through our first best practice recommendation, which is to continuously discover every identity and its access?
Yeah, so it might sound repetitive, but when you're talking about security, it's about risk assessment and then knowing where to apply controls. Step 1 in that recipe is comprehensive discovery. You want to scan your identity providers. You want to scan your agentic AI platforms. You want to scan your cloud service providers. You want to scan servers, endpoints. You want to scan across your infrastructure. gathering as many identities, what permissions they have access to, and to what resources, and get that into a view so that you can start to assess the risk. We call that posture. You want to assess where the most risk is, because you don't want to start deploying your teams on something that may take a long time, but reduce your risk by very little. You want to focus on the biggest areas of risk and kind of get the best ROI for your investment.
Jason, that really lands, and it's the oldest rule in security, isn't it? You can't protect what you can't see. And with agents multiplying fast, the gap is only getting bigger on the discovery front. Now let's cover the second best practice, eliminating standing access. It's been a core tenet of Zero Trust since the concept was introduced back in 2010, more than 15 years ago, and here we are, still working on it. Brian, why has just-in-time access been so hard to get right? And what's finally pushing teams to move now, given Mythos and related tools?
Well, there's a variety of reasons why this is so much easier said than done, and why it's taken us so long to arrive at a place of zero standing privilege. It's mostly to do with friction, quite frankly. It's very hard to do just in time and still get work done. So the attackers know that, and an AI-driven attacker is going to target their playbook at finding identities with standing privilege, because they can do the most damage by exploiting one of those vulnerabilities or compromising one of those identities. So the most effective defense, though, is to make sure there is no standing privilege. Like I said, easier said than done. But privileges that only exist for moments, when they're only needed at the time they're needed, and then disappear when the task that required their privilege is done. That way, even if that privilege or that identity is compromised, there's nothing for them to exploit, because they don't have the possibility of authorizing. They don't have the opportunity to enumerate and chain vulnerabilities. And even if they've stolen a password, a static credential, they won't have any opportunity to have standing access, because they'll be authenticated via some sort of multi-factor or step-up authentication via that just in time. So we saw this play out in one customer who eliminated their standing privilege across their entire hybrid environment using Delinea. And there are a couple of things about this that stuck with me. On the cloud side, their DBAs used to have permanent admin roles so that they could access the production databases in AWS. So anytime those database admin identities would get compromised, it would be totally exploitable. What you do when you implement just in time through what we can do with the Delinea platform, you eliminate those roles entirely. The DBA needs to do something that requires privilege, like a query or a schema change. They request that through the platform pretty seamlessly, and then they get a time-bound session that's brokered by the platform, and the platform expires the privilege the very moment the work is done. And that's in the cloud. When in on-prem, we can do the same things with the Linux fleet of machines, and that's often a gap for some solutions, is being able to address Linux servers and workstations. And so, Linux in particular is very commonly known for there being shared root accounts and individuals who have sudo access on the command line. And so, engineers will authenticate, use their corporate identity, they'll do their multi-factor, they'll get their device posture, and Delinea will then give them just enough privilege at the time they require it only for the server that they need it for, and for the task they need it for. And then that privilege then disappears the moment they log out. So again, it gets much more seamless, and that friction that inhibited us from getting to zero standing privilege has gone away. And so at that point, the value of a privileged identity is actually gone from the attacker's point of view, because there's nothing there for them to leverage in a compromise.
Yeah, thanks for that, Brian. And I think your hybrid example was spot on. The cloud admin role and the on-prem root account are exactly what attackers are hunting for. And with Delinea, customers were able to take that attack vector off the table. But as we know, for most customers, getting to zero standing privilege is a journey, and there are still plenty of credentials in the meantime. Credentials theft is still the number one way in, and AI adversaries are using tools like Mythos to harvest them at scale. That is why our third best practice is to minimize and broker secrets, eliminate them where you can, and protect those you cannot remove. So Jason, what are you recommending to customers as they think about secrets today, and where do they have the blind spots?
Yeah, well, the goal is to eliminate, like Brian said, he walked us through several use cases. But sometimes that's not possible or it's too much effort. And so in those cases, then you want to minimize and broker those secrets. And I'll give a concrete example. CI/CD pipelines. CI/CD pipelines are what deploy provision infrastructure, deploy configuration application changes. A lot of times, those are going to need privileged credentials to the database, to the Kubernetes clusters. In those cases, you don't want to embed those secrets, those credentials into those files, because then the developer has access. They're sitting around. Anybody who gets admin access to those repos or to those pipeline tools will be able to get that. And so in those cases, you want to actually redirect and pull the secret from a vault or provision a secret when it's used during runtime. So that is one example of where you might have a need for a privileged credential, but you don't want to embed it, or you don't want to leave it laying around, or you don't want to leave it in a file somewhere in a repo. You actually want to use a technique where you can actually inject that secret real time or at runtime, and then rotate that secret after it's done. And so you've now minimized or reduced who has access, who could potentially get access to it, as well as how long you need that privileged credential. That's just one area, but you want to look through, use your discovery, look through where these credentials are. These could be API secrets, they could be OAuth tokens, they could be usernames and passwords. You want to find where they are and start to eliminate them or broker them wherever you can.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Jason. The brokering pattern is such a clean way to keep the credential out of the developer's hands without breaking the workflow. As you mentioned, as most organizations adopt these types of techniques, it simply means that when an attacker finds a credential, it is of limited value to them. Brian, let's talk about our fourth best practice, moving to a continuous authorization approach. This is the shift from just checking the identities at the door and authorizing what they do continuously throughout the session. How do your customers react when you talk about this to them? And how does it actually work in practice when teams operationalize this concept?
So let's frame it and compare it to just-in-time access. Just-in-time access is essentially the initial authentication, giving someone access to something when they initially request it. However, once someone is into a session, whether it's provided just in time or otherwise, a more traditional session, the way I frame it is this: is that whether it's an AI-driven attack or a legitimate user, during that session, they may have a lot of data or application endpoints that are not sensitive or don't require any additional authorization to be there. But during that session, they may shift their workflow to something that's more sensitive, and that means the point of entry check isn't enough. Whether it's just in time or not, you need to actually recheck based on the condition of the user, the device, the resource that they're trying to access, the risk context overall, and then reauthorize them just to double check. Right, this is layers of security within the layer of identity security, so layers upon layers, if you will. And what we recommend is this pattern where you define your access policies in one place and enforce them everywhere. And that way you can adapt on the fly right as conditions change, such as who the user is, what device they're on. So we may provide one user different conditional access based on whether they're coming from a personal device, from a work laptop, or maybe they're coming from a laptop you trust, and maybe the phone, even if it's corporate issue, we say that as riskier. So these are the types of contexts that we can adapt to in real time, and that way, you turn the session itself into an active layer of defense. So even if the identity is compromised at the initial authentication, they've used some stolen credentials, maybe they're man-in-the-middling a multi-factor, and they get in the front door. As soon as they try to go to something sensitive or high value, you can cut that attacker off mid-session, mid-move, and we're recording it the whole time. So we have the evidence of what they tried to do and why we made the decision to cut them off.
Yeah, Brian, that is super helpful. And it's why moving to a continuous authorization approach is so important, and not simply keeping your session recordings for compliance, to meet compliance requirements. Now, of course, no security discussion these days can happen without addressing AI agents, which we touched upon briefly earlier in the session. So that brings us to the last best practice, which is to treat AI agents as first-class privileged identities. Jason, are customers there yet with this recommendation? What are the leading customers doing out there? And what are the risks for those teams that are hanging back and waiting behind?
Yeah, a few weeks ago, I was at our customer advisory board, and we had 12 customers there. And this was a common pattern shared by all of those customers who now have AI agents in their environments. And their recommendation to us collectively was to treat these as first-class identities, meaning they wanted to, first of all, they wanted the discovery and they wanted visibility alongside human identities, alongside service accounts. They wanted to see the identity graph. They wanted to see what access, what permissions did those identities have, and to what resources. They wanted all of that in a graph. The second thing they wanted is full lifecycle and governance. They wanted to know who was the human sponsor that registered or created this identity, what was it allowed to do, and they wanted access certifications. They wanted to go back periodically and check and see who are these sponsors, and do their sponsors still attest to having to need those identities for those AI agents. And then the last thing is they wanted to start applying controls. They wanted to start applying controls, what MCP access do they have? What other agents can they communicate with? Where's the audit trail and audit history? So these are the same practices that we do for humans and other machine access. And so they wanted to treat it the same way: discovery, governance, and start applying controls.
That's super helpful, Jason. And for the listeners today, if for any reason you haven't engaged with your non-security counterparts on agents yet, we all know the usage is already happening. Reach out to whoever is rolling out AI in your organization. Get those conversations started early. That's how you can get controls in place before the AI sprawl gets ahead of you, and before models like Mythos take advantage of this sprawl. So, Brian, to wrap things up, we've walked through 5 best practices, and the connecting line through all of this is that identity is the layer that holds up when something like Mythos changes the math. Can you tell us how the identity risk assessment Delinea offers helps customers actually start putting these best practices into action?
Absolutely. So what we're able to do at Delinea is mapping directly to our first best practice that Jason outlined for us. It's the discovery piece. We want to get you started and get you that clear picture of where your identities live, where the privilege within those identities exist, and what agents in particular might already be operating in your environment. Without this, you can't do anything else. This is ground zero, starting blocks. And so we want to get you off the starting blocks and running. And so as a part of a typical pre-sales engagement, we offer you a free identity risk assessment. What you'll do is work with your sales engineer the way you normally would, and reach out to them however you normally would, and we'll bring in one of our field CISOs to support them. And these are people that come from deep CISO backgrounds, and they're going to do more than hand you a report. They're going to give you deep insights into which risks are the ones you should be most concerned with, what the potential, even dollar value of an exploit or a compromise would look like if that privileged identity was compromised. One of those risks, was successfully turned into an exploit or an attack. And so this is what's going to make it really genuinely useful. You're going to, once you spend a couple days time with our team, you'll be able to get this discovery report back. We'll set up the time with you, and you'll come out of that with actionable steps moving forward, so you can get past starting blocks, get past best practice number 1, and start moving on to 2, 3, 4, and 5. So get started. Reach out to your account team. Not sure who that is. There's contact information throughout this webinar that'll get you to the right person.
Brian, thank you for that. And I encourage our listeners to reach out to Delinea or your partner to book your identity risk assessment and help your organizations be Mythos ready. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Brian. And thanks everyone for their time.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.